Thank you. I wasn't really expecting to be standing sort of up on a pedestal in front of in a big sort of auditorium, especially on a Sunday morning at 9 o'clock after a party, which isn't the best timing. But it's all fine, and as long as you're all okay and don't want to come nearer to make me feel a little bit more at home, that's fine. But I think we're okay, and we can continue. I have to say that this subject is very dear to my heart. It's a very important subject for me, partly because I think our idea of the triple heater is quite confused, and it's not strange that it should be so confused because it's been confused throughout the thousands of years of Chinese writing and history. Lots of people have got lots of different ideas and ways of explaining what the triple heater is. And that's one of the reasons I find it so fascinating. And one of the things I wanted to do, because we've got a very short time, and I'm wondering, because we started a bit late, will we have a little bit extra on the end or not? Do we have to finish exactly on time? Okay, so we have to go really quickly. In a way, I wanted to re-establish this connection, which is really important, of the triple heater with this idea of the fire of the gate of life. And we tend to think of the triple heater quite happily in terms of its function as a kind of irrigation channel. And this is the way it's talked about to a certain extent in the Neijing, Suwen, and Ling Shu. And it's when we come to the text of the Nanjing that we find some really interesting things about this connection of the triple heater and what we might call Ming Men, or the fire of the gate of life. So what I want to do is to go through a couple of early texts of the Nanjing just to sort of show this connection, and then talk a little bit at the end about another text which has this very interesting and slightly enigmatic expression that the triple heater, the Sanjiao, and what is called usually the Shinju, or the heart protector, have a name but no form. And there's been discussion over the centuries about what this might mean. So I want to go through sort of a few texts as we go along. But first of all, I have to... I just wanted to put up the Chinese characters for the Sanjiao. I tend to get very excited about the Chinese characters, particularly because I've worked so much with Claude Lar and Elizabeth Rochard de la Vallée, who are sinologists. And I could almost say that their explanation of some of the terminology of Chinese medicine is what I feel has given me a kind of rooting in my practice and an understanding of what we mean by some of these slightly bizarre terms that we're never quite sure about. So we'll have a look a little bit more at the character for Jiao a little bit later, but it's an interesting one. And one of the first things to see is that it has 4 strokes underneath, which is one of the ways to express fire. So we actually almost have a picture of a cooking pot with a bird on top of it and a fire underneath, so it suggests a slow cooking of something. And throughout the whole idea of the triple heater, we have this idea of something which is a composition of water and fire. It's what the fire is able to do to the water, and how the fire of both the Ming Men and the triple heater is able to transform the fluids into energy, how that whole energy system functions, how that whole qi generation system functions through what is sometimes called the fire of Ming Men and sometimes called the fire of the triple heater. And some of our confusions with terminology happen because at different times in history, different terms were used for different ideas and expressions. And one of the things we find if we look at the texts of the Neijing, Suwen, and Ling Shu, for example, they have no mention of Ming Men, maybe very, very briefly, and no real mention of, say, Yuan Qi. And it's not until we get to the later text of the Nanjing that they really talk about the Yuan Qi, which we see very strongly connected with Ming Men and the triple heater within the Nanjing. So we'll just have a look at a couple of those texts. And with Ming Men, the Life Gate, which of course is the title of our conference, it's an interesting character, Ming, because we tend to nowadays translate it as the gate of life, when I was first a student, it was always called the Gate of Destiny. And then I think it was decided that destiny was a bit of a weird and wonderful, slightly contentious kind of a term. But if the Chinese had wanted it to be the gate of life, they would have used a different character. And this term Ming is to do with something that we bring into our life. It's almost like our inherited potential. And so the idea of destiny, which is a little bit weird, but it's more like what we're destined to be and what we're destined to have in terms of the energy that we inherit. And then, of course, it's what we do with that. In more Taoist texts, we see this idea of Ming as the life force or the inherited, very closely connected with the Jing, what we inherit, what we bring in, our sort of constitutional force in a way. And then there's the idea of the Xing, which is the true nature. And Xing's a very interesting character because on the left-hand side there's the character for the heart, slightly changed and pushed to the side. And on the right-hand side is the character for to bring life into something. So this is a very nice character that's used a lot, both in medical and also Taoist texts, for what we do with that destiny that we're given. It's almost like, how does our heart transform that destiny? How in our life do we work with that? So it's often seen to be this relationship between the Xing and the Ming. What we're born with, what we do with it, and what we sort of make of that potential, as it were. And we also have these two expressions that, again, we come up with in text, and we're not always quite clear what they are, and again, quite strange translations we've had over the years, sometimes nowadays called pre- and post-heaven. In the Chinese, that's really how they need to be translated most accurately. Again, purely meaning what we inherit and what we then take in and how we transform and work with that. So we have the idea of the triple heater and Ming men being very, very tied up with this idea of what we call pre-heaven, or our inherited tendencies, and the post-heaven being much more to do with what that transformative energy is able to do with the air that we breathe, the food that we eat, and the way we actually utilize that energy. So this is a very typical and very often quoted text from the Ling Shu, which is sort of the basis for a lot of our understanding of the triple heater. They talk about the three separate heaters, and that the upper heater is described as a mist, and it's got the character at the top for clouds. And we remember that lung 1 and 2 have clouds, and the cloud character is in both of these points. So there's the idea that there's a cloud, misty quality to the top of the chest. And then this second, in the middle heater, the character is it's sometimes translated as a maceration. It's a kind of that idea where we get that idea of the rotting and ripening of things in the middle jiao. And the lower heater is called a drainage ditch or a channel, and it's that often gives us some of the more, I would say, mundane idea of the functions of the triple heater, that it kind of decides where the fluids have to go. But what we have to remember is that the movement and the transformation of fluids always has to come from the fire. So it's this fire-water balance constantly in all the actions of the triple heater. And then we have this idea, which is again goes back to the earliest text of the Wei Qi belonging to the lower jiao, the Yin Qi or the nutritional Qi belonging to the middle jiao, and the Zong Qi or the ancestral or the gathering Qi of the upper jiao. And this is made very clear in the very early text that these are the areas that these, and it's not that the Qi is purely in that area, but it's sort of like the Qi that's it's where the chi is kind of mostly coming from, as it were, or created. And the idea of the zong chi gathering in the center of the chest. We also have this term minister fire, which will come up again against a little bit later, which is the idea of the fire in its kind of active role in the body rather than its so-called passive activity of the heart, which needs to have this kind of rather quiet, empty quality to be able to receive the spirits. The minister fire is more the idea of the fire in its action. And we have the second aspect of the heart, which we call various things. Lately, we usually call it the pericardium. But that's the active quality of fire, which is usually called minister fire. And this is just rather a nice little picture. And the text on the side is translated that the triple heater is the master of summer heat and minister fire, and its meridian category is the Han Shao Yang. And in the Chinese text above that, we introduce this idea of this name without form, which I want to go on to a bit later on. And this is a very lovely quote from Zhang Jiebin. I just wanted to make another connection here. The triple burner, though it is the fu of all drainage and irrigation of the middle, it's also that which gathers together and protects the yang. There's nothing that it does not envelop and surround. So while we think of this as the triple heater's function of taking care of the drainage and the irrigation in the center, as it were, there's this very important function that it gathers together and protects the yang. And the idea that there's nothing that it doesn't envelop or surround brings us back to the character of Jiao, which has a very similar, you can see the similarity between the Jiao character, which has the fire at the bottom, and then there's this character for Wei, which has the silk thread, or the character, the little bit of the character we see, for example, in the meridians, something that's threading and connecting. And this is the way of the extraordinary meridians, the yin and yang wei mai. And there's this very lovely idea with the wei that there's a protection and a connection and a holding together, which is very much the function of the wei mai. And it's this exact same character, which is said to represent, I mentioned that it could be an ideogram for a bird in its very early etymological descriptions. And more than just being the bird, it's about the way the feathers of a bird protect and surround. And it's also seen in something like a bunch of bananas, which has a central stem and the way the bananas come around. So it's the idea of an overlapping protective coating, and it's in quite a few terms that have that idea of a protection. So that link with the Sanjiao and the Wei Mai, and of course we see that in the Yang Wei Mai with the point triple heater 5. And we come back to this idea of the enveloping and surrounding a little bit later when we talk about the function of the name without form again. Okay, so sorry, I hope I'm not, I have to keep looking here, so I'm swinging around the microphone. This is just one of the rather nice diagrams that if any of you are familiar with Paul Unschel's version of the Nanjing, he has some of these very nice diagrams of the Nanjing text. Really interesting to see how they laid out some of these Chinese texts, really as if they're diagrammatic explanations of what they're actually talking about in the text. So this is the first of our Nanjing texts, which I think is a really interesting one. So it says the qi that moves between the kidneys, below the navel, is the life and the destiny, which is the sheng, which is the sheng for life, is the sheng of the generation cycle. It's like the cycle of the generation of life. So it's the life and the destiny, Ming, of a human being. It's the root and the foundation of the 12 meridians, hence it's called origin, Yuan. The 3 heaters are the agents for the distribution of original qi, Yuan qi. They govern the free circulation of the 3 qi, which we just saw as the Wei qi, the Ying qi and the Zong qi, and their passage through the 5 zang and the 6 fu. When the 5 zang and the 6 fu are ill, one needles the source, which again, different commentators will say, well, what do we mean by the source? Usually it's taken as that we needle the Yuan source points. Some people, there's commentators saying slightly different things. But here we have this text which makes this instant connection between the triple heater, which is the agent for the distribution of the Yuan qi. And a very strong connection with the origin. A very similar, slightly different text in Nanjing 8. The 12 meridians, the Jingmai, are connected with the source of the vital qi, or the life qi, the sheng qi. The source of the vital qi is the root and foundation of the 12 meridians. That is the moving qi between the kidneys. And some people describe the moving qi between the kidneys as almost another way of talking about Ming Men. So we know that we have the kidney back shoe points at bladder 23 and the Ming Men point in the center. And the moving qi between the kidneys is often the way of describing the interaction between this area, what happens in this area. This qi is the foundation of the 5 tsang and the 6 fu, the root of the 12 meridians, the gate of exhalation and inhalation. Now if anyone, I don't know if any of you were just doing the Qigong session with Peter Dedman, but he very much was starting by, we had our hands here, and bringing the qi forward and then describing the meridian system. And in a way it was a very lovely description of exactly what we're talking about here. And it's important that we remember these things. You know, they're kind of very, very basic in some ways, but they are the way the whole system functions and works. And this description of the gate of inhalation and exhalation is rather nice. The source, Yuan, of the triple heater. It's also called the guardian of the spirits against perverse influences. So it's a pretty strong text. But again, we have this connection of the triple heater with the source. This is a little diagram which actually says that quite well, which comes from the very lovely, now quite old book, which was written by Stephen Birch and Kiku Matsumoto, called The Hara Diagnosis, Reflections in a Sea. They've got a lot of interesting stuff around this in that book. And this was a diagram which comes from that book. So there is copyright, of course. We have to be careful with these things. And it's a nice description of where the energies of heaven and earth, which you could say pre and post heaven, come together, and Ming Men is the point where they enter the body, become this moving qi between the kidneys, spread out into the meridian system. And this is a commentary on that text from the 7th century, the 14th century. The triple heater is the space between the 5 tsang and the 6 fu, the gate of water and grains, the steam of transformation. Its qi blends in this space. It's called upper, middle, and lower. each of this has its own name, it is the alternative messenger of the true original chi. And then a commentary on the text from the 8th century. Below the umbilicus is the moving chi between the kidneys. This is Dantian. Dantian is the root of the being, the place where the Jing and Shen are stored. The term Dantian we don't find in the early texts. It's a sort of later, more Taoist alchemical text, but some people would say that it's pretty much the same as Ming Men. It's a later way of describing that. Sorry. Some of you may be familiar with this rather lovely picture of the Taoist internal body map, and this is rather a lovely little description of the fires happening and the transformation of the fire. And this is an interesting way of looking at it, and there's quite a few illustrations in the early commentaries on the Nanjing that use these I Ching trigrams and hexagrams to describe this relationship of the fire and the water. And, for example, that hexagram is often used with the two yin lines representing the kidneys and the yang line in the middle representing Ming Men. So Ming Men, the life gate, is a region located between the kidneys. It is in all probability of embryonic origin. Now this is something that I think is really, really interesting, and I've had conversations last night with a few of us who are getting to sort of retirement age, if there's ever such a thing, and saying almost like, if you had another life, what would you do? And my answer at the moment is I'd study embryology. Because I think the relationship between Chinese medicine and embryology, if it was done really well, would be the most fascinating study possible. There's so much that's explained in Chinese medicine by a study of embryology. The strange interrelationships of weird bits of the body that we think, well, how come that's related to that? If we look into the way the embryological tissues moved and dispersed, there's some really fantastically interesting information there. And as I say, if I had another life, I would be studying the relationship between the extraordinary meridians and embryology or something like that, because I hope someone does it as a PhD sometime soon. This is a nice little illustration of that, which comes from Claude Lahr and Elizabeth Rochard's very, very early book called The Survey of Chinese Medicine, which has got some real kind of little sort of pearls in it, actually. And they have a whole section on the possibility of some of these embryological connections. In their early work, they worked with a French doctor who was actually a specialist in embryology. So in their early work, they did some very interesting looking into some of this, and how do these rather strange Chinese terminology maybe refer to the way tissues sort of move and migrate within the development of the body. I'll go very quickly through these, but I just wanted to give you an idea of this concept that we have to remember that Ming Men and the triple heater are seen as this input of life which actually goes out and develops, and then the way that's maintained from the center throughout adult life is said to be taken on by the triple heater function. And this book was out of print for a while, but it is back in print now, so it is possible to get hold of it, which is rather good. And this is a little summary of that. The hereditary energies that originate in the Qi Jing Ba Mai, the 8 extraordinary meridians, are carried through the adult system by the triple heater. This is one of those strange, enigmatic, diagrammatic things of Nanjing 8, which was the last text that we read. And I've got a pointer thing, I don't think I have. I'm just going to go and point, and then I'll come back. Because here you have a diagram of the kidneys, and on the left-hand side we have the kidney, and on the right-hand side we have Ming Men. So this was another idea that came up, and we don't know if it was a kind of symbolic way of looking at the left and the right, which often happens in the Chinese text, but the idea that the left is the water aspect of the lower jiao and is the water kidney, and that the fire aspect of the kidney is here called Ming Men. And we see this, I'm not going to go into this very deeply, but the classics say that there are 5 Fu and 6 Zhang. How is this? And this is a strange, complicated thing about why are there sort of 12 meridians and only 11 organs, and why are there 2 of this and 1 of this? And it goes, there's a few chapters that talk about this. And this is because one speaks of the kidneys of having a double storage. On the left is the kidney, on the right is Ming Men, the gate of life. Ming Men is the space where the essences and spirits, Jing Shen, are stored. In men, it stores the essence, which can, in this context, sometimes be translated as the sperm, but it's the essence. In women, it connects, and it's an interesting character, this connection, because it's sometimes the idea of a connection is just a kind of mechanical thing. It's much more, it gives sustenance to, and it kind of creates a kind of inflow between the reproductive organs, so it connects with the uterus. The triple heater is indeed a Fu, but it does not depend on any Tsang. So this is just part of this description of what's called a Tsang and what's called a Fu and why, which goes on in the Nanjing. Because I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but the Nanjing literally means difficult issues or difficult questions and or difficulties. And it's mostly difficulties that the scholars at that time were having with understanding the Neijing. So they often would quote a little bit from the Neijing and say, well, what does this mean? And so that it would then be discussed, which is really what the whole literature of Chinese medicine has been. Like, what did they mean by that? Another very similar one. I won't spend time on this because it's very similar to the last one, but another one of this idea of the connecting with the uterus and the sperm. And this, interestingly, is the illustration for that last chapter. And we actually have in the writing on either side, in men, essences are stored. In women, the uterus is attached. And this idea of the use of the trigrams and hexagrams, again, for fire and water. And another nice illustration. If any of you are interested in illustrations, they've got a fantastic resource now at the Wellcome Institute where you can search online for various illustrations, and which is a really lovely resource, actually. So this was something I found in the Wellcome Library. More of the same. This is an old illustration showing the kidney on one side and Ming Men on the other side. So this idea of the gate of life or the gate of destiny, Ming Men, as being the right kidney for quite some time. Nowadays we might call it kidney yin and kidney yang. That wasn't a term that was used until quite a lot later. But it's this idea that we have this fire and the water in the lower jiao. And we've called them different things over time, in a way. Interesting as well, excuse me, just in terms of that, that if we look at the pulse pictures over time, and one of the things, another really interesting study that Stephen Birch did was to really have a good study of the pulse and how the pulse positions have been seen over time. And we find in that right hand, what I call the lower jiao position, really changes over time. And some of the earliest texts call it Ming Men. Then we have the Nanjing texts, which tend to use the triple heater pericardium distinction of this pulse. And then in later text still, we sometimes have it called as kidney yang. So we have this evolving, changing discussion of what this pulse actually is. But it's the fire in the lower jiao, basically, and all of those descriptions are saying the same thing. Okay, now for the last 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, I just want to talk a little bit, 10 minutes actually, just want to talk a little bit of this idea of the name but no form, which is a strange idea, and it's been discussed as to what this might mean over the centuries. And again, it starts with one of these questions of there are 12 meridians, 5 sang and 6 fu. And then we go into the Shaoyin of the hand, which is the heart channel, and the Shinju, what we tend to call the heart master pericardium, are separate mine. The Shinju and the Sanjiao are related internally and externally. These have a name but no form. It's because of that that one speaks of the meridians saying that they're 12. So there's discussions about, okay, why does the heart have 2 meridians? Why does the kidney have double organ? So this is what's going on in these particular chapters. That's just a version of that. And then we have a commentary on that from a later commentator. Form is derived from no form, and then it can function. Therefore, the function of the yin and yang organs and the meridians is truly brought about by the master of the heart and the triple warmer. So this is the first, you could say, the first idea of what this means to have no form. The idea that in pre-heaven, it's the area of no form. When we come into life, into post-heaven, there's form. And this is an idea that really informs all the Taoist texts of this idea of coming from what we call wuxing, or no form, into having form, and how certain practices and exercises relate us back again to that sort of original qi state. So we have the idea of the jing and the yuan qi, the original state of us belonging to this sort of, almost be connecting us to this no form, and then the function of the body is to bring that into form. So this is almost suggesting that the triple heater and the heart master pericardium, although pericardium is not a good description for this actual function, is the kind of link between this, what we call the form and the no form, or the pre-heaven and the post-heaven. And here, the triple warmer has a name but no form. The upper warmer unites with the master of the heart. The lower warmer unites with the right kidney. Ming Men. This is the idea of having form and not having form, which, as I say, you find it's discussed so much in more the Taoist texts, but also the early Chinese medical texts. But there's another idea of what having no form may be, which is that it's not got much of a shape. This is contested by some of the commentators in earlier times, because they would be very much related to this idea of form and no form in the idea of the way we come into being. But much later, and particularly with quite a few Japanese commentators, there was this idea of form and no form having the meaning that they're not discrete organs, they're kind of shapeless. So both the idea of the tissues around the heart that protect the heart, and also this idea of the triple heater having no particular form. And later, again, there's been quite a lot of comment on this is to do with the fascia and the way the fascia line the organs, which is again going back to the idea of the jiao as being what surrounds things and protects things. So there's some very interesting interrelationships between the idea of the way the qi is transformed and moved in the system and the fascia, which is brought up by some of these later commentators. Here, he mentions the Huang Men, which is, and again, this is a very interesting idea. The idea in the early text of the Huang, I don't know whether many of you have come across the idea of the Gao and the Huang, which are considered to be very primitive tissues in the body. And either side of the triple heater points on the back, so the back shoe points of the triple heater and the outer bladder points, the outer bladder line points of the triple warmer are called Huang Men, which is the gate of this strange early tissue. And then, of course, level with the pericardium, we have the points that are called Gao Huang Shu, which are to do with the energy of the vital circulation. Two really, really important points, and 2 points that are used a lot in severe depletion. It's like when someone is really severely depleted, particularly bladder 43, but also 51, can be used. It's almost like to regenerate on a very, very deep level. And here it's suggesting that Huang Men, this point bladder 51, which is to the right and left of the triple warmer shoe point, because the qi of the triple warmer comes out from there and goes to the whole body. So it's seen as this point which is really able to nourish and warm and circulate the qi of the whole body. Points I use a lot. They're kind of weird and wonderful points, but they're extremely, I think they're absolutely wonderful points, not used enough. And of course we have Huang points either side of the navel in kidney 16. Again, close to the origin and the generation of things. Okay, we've got 5 minutes. I just wanted to give this such a lovely picture, and it shows the location, the way of locating those points either side of the pericardium shoe points. This is just a little bit on the fascia. We've only got 5 minutes, but there's this interesting guy called James Oshman who has written a couple of books. He's written a lot of papers which are extremely interesting, and he talks about the fascia as being the biochemically and bioelectrically active change of tissue capable of a variety of communication transfers, posited by many people as being the flow of energy in the meridians, the flow of whatever is happening biochemically, bioelectrically in these tissues. This is one of his diagrams of how that happens. Okay, so the three heaters by themselves form a whole study whose breadth is so great that it could cover the entire pathogenesis of acupuncture. Another quote from the Survey of Chinese Medicine. So I've whipped through some of these things, and it's been, all I want to do is to generate some thinking and some ideas around this, because for me it's one of the most interesting subjects and rather neglected, I feel. So this is a Sun Tzu Miao quote: "The three heaters through their interconnections make a unity. They govern the way of the spirits, which come and go in the 5 Tsang and the 6 Fu. They know how to distribute life in the form of qi. They're connected to the origin, yuan. They make blood and maintain life through the spirits." So that kind of says it all, really. And then I just thought I'd put that up as an end picture. Okay, we don't have any time for questions, but is there anything really fast? Do we have a couple of minutes? If we've got any time for a couple of questions, that would be great. I don't know. I certainly know that that question was actually asked of Claude Lahr, and he was saying that you can't say directly by reading the classical text that that's what they were talking about, but it's really implied, and particularly the idea of the 8 extraordinary meridians being to do with the actual unfolding and the development of things, and then at birth, once the breath and the food take over, the the 12 become active. That's said pretty clearly within some of the texts of the Neijing, but you have to really search to find it. Have you? No, I don't think it's said implicitly. They would say it's implied. Yeah. Yeah. But I think that little section, I'm sure you've read their survey, but that little section, I agree, I want, which is why if I had another life, I would try and find out. Good, thank you.